Hello everyone, I'm Maggie Dobrev, librarian at Bull Library, part of Prince William Public Libraries. Today, our guest is Sarah Eden. Oops, just a sec. Proper Romance author and 3 times Whitney Award winner. She has written more than 60 novels. She will be chatting with us about the second novel in the Dread Penny Society, The Gentleman and the Thief. Welcome to Prince William Public Libraries, Sarah.
Thank you.
And now, Miss Eden, the stage is yours.
Woohoo! When I was first asked to come and do this visit here with the library, I thought for quite a while about what I could talk about, what I could present, what I could offer that might be helpful or interesting to people who were tuning in, things that I might be able to share with you. So to give you a background on why I ended up choosing what I did, I'll explain a little bit about my own history as a writer. I did not intend to become a writer. A lot of times you talk to authors and they'll say, oh, I always wanted to write, or I always wanted to be an author. And that was not me at all. When I went to university, I originally intended to study physics with an emphasis in quantum theory. So it's about as far from a historical author as you can get. And in the end, settled on a degree in research because I adored research and studying and learning things. And I ended up writing historical fiction, which obviously involves a lot of research. And I applied a lot of what I learned from my degree to the act of researching for fiction. And so I thought today I might share with you a few things I've learned along the way about doing good research. Whether you're researching for fiction itself as a writer, whether you're wanting to learn more about a time period or a location or an era that you've been reading about, or simply are curious about something, I thought I'd share with you some of the expert tips that I have learned along the way. So I'm going to actually pop up here my screen so that I can take you through a little PowerPoint so that I can share that with you. So it's going to take just a moment for it to come up. And I'm going to put it into present mode. Okay, hopefully all of you can see that. I'm going to cover just 3 areas of research that have been helpful for me as I've researched for my fiction and as I've researched for other things. General versus detailed research, we're going to talk about the difference in those, unexpected sources and search tricks, as well as expert etiquette and expectations. Okay, I'm actually going to back up a minute because I've clicked too far. One thing that has helped me as I've been doing research is to understand the difference between general research and detailed research. General research is the research you do before you start writing. It's the research you do to get a good grasp on your big picture, on the setting where your story takes place, on your characters, the things that have a big general impact on their life. One tip I'm going to toss out there, even though general research is what you do before you start writing, it's always important to research anything that would have a major impact on your plot. Because if you find out after you've written your book that that's inaccurate, you're going to have wasted a lot of time. I've read books where a major plot element is actually not historically possible. And because it was so central to the book itself, it makes the entire book problematic. So if you have something either culturally or historically or in a location that your entire plot hinges around, it's a good idea to look that up before you start writing, even if it's not a general thing, but something more specific. And then we have what's known as detail research, which is usually done during the writing process. It's when you come across small things, little details that make a difference in what you're writing. And those little things help to build that authentic picture that you're working on. One of the areas that tends to fall under detailed research is characters' occupations and hobbies and experiences. If you're writing about a librarian, for example, you ought to take time to find out what a librarian's job entails, some of the words they use to refer to the things they do in their job. So those are things you'll come across while you're writing, as opposed to your larger big picture things. Another tip to go along with that, I've found it's really, really easy when you're doing your detail research to get distracted from the writing itself. You'll go to look up something specific and find yourself going down the rabbit hole of information. And before you know it, you've lost out on a lot of writing time. So one thing I've started doing is when I come across something like that I don't know the answer to, I'll write it down on a list to look up later. So that's something that's helped me not get distracted from my writing in order to do research. Another thing that has been helpful for me is to find sources that I wouldn't have thought of before I started doing detailed research myself. There are some sources you probably have already thought of, things like writer's guides, historical nonfiction texts, if you're writing history, other nonfiction texts, Wikipedia, there's an asterisk, so we're going to talk about that in a second, documentaries, things like that are sources we tend to think of off the top of our head when we're wanting to learn about something through research. But there are less commonly thought of sources that I've come to rely on more over the years. Reading fiction. If you're researching for fiction, then reading other works of fiction in that same genre or time period or setting or featuring characters with the same occupation or the same cultural background can be helpful. Another asterisk, because again, we're going to talk about that in a second, it's really helpful for things like voice, getting a feel for how that genre, that time period sounds. It's good for learning vocabulary, for general research into an area, an era or a location. We all hopefully, since we're here for a library discussion, know that our local libraries are a tremendously good source for research and information, but we don't always think of university libraries. If you live near a university, that can be a great resource as well. They have very extensive collections. Many of them allow even non-students to have access to the building and the resources itself, even though they can't always check things out, but that can be a great place to go and look for more information. Another thing that we don't always think of are expert presenters. This library here brings in authors to present on their books, on their areas of expertise. That can be a great resource for learning things you don't know otherwise. Universities and colleges sometimes offer open to the public lectures by their faculty, by their grad students. Those are great sources. Podcasts and presentations at conferences can be great places to go and get additional information about specific things you're researching. Now, for the things that I put in the asterisks, that's a word I can never say correctly the first time. The reason I put that there is because there are things we need to remember about them. Wikipedia was one of those. It is a great place to start your research, but it's not a great place to end it. One of the best things to find on Wikipedia is the sources and the bibliography on an article. If you scroll to the bottom of the page, you'll find links to where that article pulled its information. And if you go to those sources, you'll get more in-depth information and learn more things. Using fiction as a source for research, we have to bear in mind it's not always accurate. Sometimes there are things in our fiction that is commonly part of it, but is actually not accurate. So that's worth looking into. The best thing that it helps you with in terms of research is your voice, the genre expectations, big picture information. Podcasts and presentations, one of the most important things to do when using that for research is to check your presenters' bios, make sure they have some reason to know what they know. We're basically checking if they have some authority or understanding. If you hear or learn of something in basically any of these places that is really different from what you've seen elsewhere, it's worth double checking and looking into. But these can all be great sources that we don't always think of when we're doing research. A few tricks I've learned along the way. Google Books is a wonderful resource. Through Google Books, you can find books that are in the public domain because they're older, but they've been digitized and so they can be searched. And that's really, really helpful, especially if you're doing historical research. Interlibrary Loan. This was something I didn't know about for a lot of years until a very helpful librarian introduced me to it. Library systems often loan books between their locations. So if your local library doesn't have it, but another library within the library system does, a lot of times they can arrange for an interlibrary loan, which is a fantastic way to get your hands on resources that are not physically near you, which can be really, really helpful. Museum websites are great, especially right now while we're all unable to travel like we used to, or museums simply aren't open. Their websites often have a tremendous amount of information, more than we realize, so that's a great place to go and look for information. When you're reading nonfiction, too many people stop at the last page of the content of it and don't continue on to the bibliography, where you find more resources and more places to go to get further information. Another great place when you're reading fiction is to look in the author's notes and acknowledgments, because they'll often reference sources they went to get their information, and it can give you sources you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. Another thing that has become kind of a favorite trick of mine is to take a nonfiction book that I've used that was helpful and search for it on Amazon, not necessarily to buy it there, but because as you scroll down, it gives you that list of other titles that people purchased in addition to that one, or searched for in addition to that one. And so you'll find things that are similar, and it helps me find new sources and new places to look for information. Okay, and the last category I was going to share with you today has to do with asking experts, asking people to help with your research. One good source of experts is museum curators and tour guides. I've had a lot of opportunities to speak with curators at museums and tour guides to get further information. One thing that in asking them, things they wish people understood about asking them for information is to not interrupt tours if you're on a formal tour, and to inquire as to whether or not they offer or schedule personal tours, because sometimes they do, and that gives you a chance to get the very detailed information that you're looking for. Another source that people don't always think of are professional researchers. There are people who do research for a living. Historians, curators, archivists, people like that. And they can be a great source because they know where to look for things. They know things that you won't. Museum websites, archives, places like that will often talk about whether or not they have professional researchers on staff. It's important to know that this service is not usually free because it's a professional service. You can usually get an estimate of what they think it will take. Sometimes if you have a really quick question, they'll answer it without charging. An example from my own research history, one of the books that I published many years ago, I desperately needed to know how long it took for someone to ride the Royal Mail from London to Scotland in 1815. It was such a specific question, and I looked and looked and looked and could not find the answer. I finally stumbled across the British Postal Museum and Archive and submitted on their website their contact form asking what it would cost for me to hire a researcher to look for that piece of information because I needed it. And they answered back that it was something that they knew really easily and they didn't charge me for it and gave me the answer. So those can be great sources of information, especially when you feel stuck yourself. Another thing to consider is whether or not it's worth paying someone to research something for you. The questions I found that have helped me decide that is, how crucial is the information to what I'm writing or doing? How tight is my deadline? Do I have time to try and find it myself? And how difficult would it be to find it myself? So if you're considering asking for help from a professional, that's a great way to decide if it's going to be helpful for you. And then another thing is there are non-researcher specific experts that you can talk to, other authors, hobbyists, people who have related occupations. If you're writing about a book that involves blacksmithing, you can talk to someone who knows how to do blacksmithing and they can answer questions for you. It's important, obviously, to be respectful of their time and to be grateful for what they're able to offer. Another one of my bonus tips, there's important things to remember when an expert has helped you. It's important to thank them. The experts I've talked to in asking what they wish people understood, they'd say you'd be amazed at how often they aren't thanked for the time that they spend. Consider sending them a copy of your book when it's published if you're doing this for book research, or including them in your acknowledgments. I've heard horror stories from research experts who have had people who reach out to them and ask for their expertise then correct them on things that they thought they got wrong. But basically, it's mostly to be considerate and polite. So this is basically the approach I take to researching. We often hear, write what you know. I like to say, know what you write. So there's just a few insights into researching, especially when you are a writer. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. Hopefully it was helpful and interesting, and that is the end of what I have to share there. So I think at that point we can move to questions if people have them, and I will toss it back over to Maggie again.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Olena, do we have any questions? We don't have any questions in the chat.
I've answered every question you have. I'm a success.
So I mean, your presentation was very interesting. Thank you very much about research.
Hopefully it was helpful to someone.
I was also wondering, do you also travel when you do research?
I have been able to do some traveling. I have traveled to the British Isles since a lot of my books are set there, so I've been able to travel over that way. I've done some traveling through the American West since I also have books set there. But yeah, traveling for research is a wonderful opportunity if you're able to do it.
Olena, we have a question in the chat. Oh, I'm sorry.
She's muted. I don't know if that's what she's trying to tell you. Okay.
Oh,
guys, we figured it out.
Oh my, I've muted her.
Yeah, I think that's what we figured out the charades. She's saying, I can't talk to you, I'm muted.
Okay, oh, I muted her again. I'm sorry.
Okay. That's good. Thank you. So we have a few questions now from our chat room. So the first question is, how long does it take you to write a novel? From research to outline and then the final draft?
It really depends a lot on the book itself. If the story is set in a time or a place that I'm not as familiar with, obviously more research needs to be done. If the book is really complicated, it can take longer. This book we're talking about today actually has 3 different stories interwoven into the book itself. And so obviously that takes a little bit longer because I'm writing 3 stories instead of just 1. The fastest I've ever had a book take from very, very, very start, conceptualizing the idea to final draft turned in, ready to go, was just under 6 months. The longest I've ever had one take was almost 10 years because so much research needed to be done. A huge portion of that was the research before I was able to actually start writing. So it varies significantly. I'd say on average, it's probably about a year.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And there is some comment. Thank you. And I am doing a mystery quilt, and the mystery is in the story. So knowing the ins and outs may help me figure out of the plot.
Yeah. It's amazing how much even sometimes little details help us flesh out the bigger aspects of our stories. So yeah, that's really helpful.
Oh, the next, okay, I'm sorry. The next question is from one of the participants. The concept of the new book is interesting with the penny dreadfuls. How did you get the idea? I never saw this format in a romance.
Yeah, it was definitely a very unique idea. I was talking with the editor of this line at this particular publisher, and it came up that we both were very big fans of the 19th century penny dreadfuls, that we'd read them. We thought they were really interesting. The idea of them being published in installments was very interesting, and what must it have been like to have written them. And it all kind of evolved from there, the idea of a story focused around people who write penny dreadfuls. And the very first time we implemented that was actually in this book, which came out not last year, but the year before. And because the two main characters were penny dreadful writers, we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to see what they were writing and how it played a role in it? And from there, it kind of organically developed into this idea of weaving their own writing into a story about them. So it just kind of developed through brainstorming, and I also have never seen anything quite like it. We weren't sure if we could pull it off, but I think it's worked out really well. It's interesting. It's a fun challenge as an author, and I think for the most part, readers have enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was very interesting how the three stories intertwined. Do you like one of them more than the other, or this is not the right question?
Not necessarily. There are different aspects of the two that I like, or of them all that I like. One thing that was fun, and this was true of the first book too, but in this one, is one of the books, one of the penny dreadfuls was clearly written for an adult audience, and one was clearly written for children. And so it was fun for me to, because I had to go back and research. I know everyone's shocked that I did more research, but how those differences actually were at the time. How the penny dreadfuls were written differently based on their audience, and then come at it with, this is a penny dreadful as it would have been written for a younger audience, this is how it would have been for an older audience, and take those different approaches. It was a challenge, but it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there is another, the same participant asks another question. Why proper romance? And what is the difference between proper and romance?
Proper Romance is just the name of this particular line with this publisher. It's the title they give to their entire romance line. And the proper is meant to indicate that it is what is known in the industry as a sweet romance. It's kind of what I would say, it's PG-13 and under, just in terms of content. Look back at Jane Austen or Jane Eyre. It's kind of that content in terms of language or steaminess or violent content, that kind of thing. It's meant to just kind of indicate, here's where it falls in the spectrum of romances. So that's what that indicates.
Thank you.
Have you ever been tempted to write something a little skinnier?
I have joked that I should start my own improper romance line. And then up the steaminess a little. I haven't, but I do joke about that.
Okay, you mentioned about the travels, but I just wanted to ask if you like, well, obviously you like to travel, so, but travels, do they inspire your work, your like plots, your designs?
Yeah, usually when I travel, it's to do specific research, but I always include in my itinerary places that are a little different than what I had expected, or different museums on different topics, or historical locations, because they inspire new ideas and new thoughts. I was able to travel to Helsinki with a friend of mine who grew up there, and I had never been to Scandinavia before, and I don't have any books that are set there, but walking through that city and seeing that culture it was absolutely inspiring. You stop and you want to, especially when you're a researcher at heart, you want to learn more. You want to understand more what you're experiencing. So yeah, it does. It's inspiring beyond just the specific set of things you're there to research. And I think that's a wonderful experience when we can have it.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, we have another question. Yeah, does your family read your books?
They better, right? No. I have a 20-year-old son who has not thus far been particularly interested in reading my romance novels. He's very supportive, but not necessarily my target audience. But I have a teenage daughter who reads them and loves them. My husband has read everything that I've written, which I think is pretty fantastic. My extended family are also very supportive. My both of my grandfathers, before they passed away, read everything I'd written up to that point and were just ecstatic. So yeah, my family's been very supportive. They read what I write, which is really nice.
Were you, did you always like romance? Like when you were growing up, did you read romance?
I've always had a romantic heart in terms of the stories that I enjoy. One of my favorite, most telling stories about myself was I was one night watching television with my husband, and we were watching The Terminator, of all things. And in the end, I'd say spoiler alert, but the movie's been out for a while. In the end, the male love interest doesn't survive. And I was so upset because that was to me not how a story is meant to end. And my husband had to say, you know, this isn't a romance, right? But my approach to most stories is everything should be a romance. So yeah, I think that I was pretty destined to write that from the very beginning.
So you seem like you discussed some things with your husband, right? Do you ever ask his advice, like in regards of your writing?
Yes, especially when it's things like, do you think a man would actually ever say this?
So another expert.
Exactly. He's the expert I turn to, and I thank him for his time. But he'll often say,
Is he
a
in the
man in a
acknowledgement?
romance novel or a man in real life? He's come to realize there is a little bit of a difference.
I was checking if he's in the acknowledgements of your book. Is he?
I don't know. Wouldn't that be awful? He's not, and I'm like, oh, I
Oh,
broke
my
my own
family
rule.
for helping. Okay, it says my family for helping me.
Okay, so umbrella acknowledgement.
So this is the second in the Dread Penny Society books, and then the third one is coming. I think it's coming next year, right? The
It comes in
Merchant and the Rogue.
August. Yes.
Is it gonna be the last one, or you have plans to write more?
No, there are plans for, at this point, there are plans for 2 more after that one. So,
Oh, so
yeah.
the Dreadmaster won't be uncovered in the next
For
one.
a little while. I'm going to make you wait because I'm mean.
I think we have the questions from our participants, some more questions. So, assuming you like to read too,
Yes.
who are some of your favorite authors?
Oh, goodness. I spent a lot of time reading nonfiction and reading historical. Actually, there's one I'm reading right now. I'm just going to grab and show you because I've been loving it. This one I just grabbed on a recommendation from a bookseller, and I've just started it, and it is fantastic. Hopefully you guys can see it in there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one I can recommend if you're looking for a great read. I've enjoyed it so far, so it's been a new one for me.
So there is one question regarding the book. I observed it doesn't have ear. Can you explain why? I don't know if they mean. Do you mean the last book, or I don't know if they can hear us, because in The Gentleman and the Thief it says in the beginning it's London.
Oh, it doesn't say what year it's in. Yeah, it does say it takes place in 1865. I'm not sure what the question is.
Is the how about the first book in the novel, in the series?
The first book does too. It's also
in the-
1865 in this one.
So the whole series is in the mid 19th century, mid to late
Yes.
19th century.
Yes.
Okay. We don't have questions from our participants yet. So I have a question. So how do you select the names of your characters for your books?
Names are one of the most fun things for me. I generally take them from either census records or marriage records at the time, or I will jump back about 20 years and check baptismal records from the era to find out what names were used at the time. Now, obviously, you have to go to the place where they would have been born. Like I have a character in these books who is from Ireland, for example. So I would check those records in Ireland to see kind of names that would be used there. But that's where I usually get them, is from historical records from the era at the time, and choose names that way so that I know it's not only possible, but it's rooted in an authentic representation of the time period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see now.
And the pseudonyms or the like Phantom Fox, how did you come up with this one?
Yes, that actually, I actually read penny dreadfuls from the 19th century because I just find them really fascinating. And they very, very often have these unique, interesting nicknames for the thieves and the criminals and the mysterious people. And so it's really inspired by that, the kind of things they would use in those published works from that era. It really is just sitting down and thinking, ooh, what could I call somebody? And making it dramatic enough to be a reflection of the dramatic literature of the time period.
Thank you. Is there, I have a question. If you could have one of your books made into a film, which book would it be and who would you cast in the lead role?
Oh, goodness. I get asked about casting a lot, and it probably shows my age, but I usually respond with a younger version of, or Richard Armitage 25 years ago. Like, I age myself so quickly with these. I think one that would make a lovely film is Ashes on the Moor. It's set in the late 1800s in a mill town in Yorkshire. I don't know who I would cast in it, but I think it would make a really nice film. It has, it would be set in the sweeping moors of northern England, so the scenery would be gorgeous. I think a lot of what occurs in that book is very timely for us today. There's a society where things are changing very quickly because of technology, because of cultures colliding in unexpected ways, because of intrusions into former ways of living. So I think it could really resonate now, and it would be beautiful, I think, because of the setting. So that's one I would love to see made into a movie.
Yeah, good. No, we don't have any questions.
I'm just so good at answering that they have no questions left.
Technically, yes, you know.
I'll take that.
If it's if it does not sound too personal, like when you were growing up, were you a fan of romance, or you became more involved in romance when you actually were older? Like
I look back at
childhood.
at myself when I was younger, and I was one of those kids who, like, after watching a television program or a movie, would then act out my own version of it or a continuation of the story. Like, in my mind, I was spinning a different version of the story or what I wanted to come next. And I think 9 times out of 10, it involved a love story. So I do think that was something I thought of at a very, very young age. It was destined to be.
Probably, yes, obviously.
Yeah. So no pressure on my husband, but I had very high expectations.
Sure.
You obviously, if your son is 20, he's meeting those high expectations for at least 20 years now.
That's right, and we're still together, so he must be doing something right.
It takes 2, actually.
Yeah, that's right.
We have, I would ask some questions about the writing process, because we have some writers groups that come to the library, not now, but in our area.
Right.
One is, do you have a writing routine?
I do. It's changed over the years based on where I was in life. When my kids were little, my writing routine was to grab a few minutes if their naps ever overlapped. But as they got older and were in school, I would write while they were in school. Now that they're old and I have a lot more time to myself, I set hours that I write during. I start out each day by reading through the notes I gave myself the day before, and then I sit down and I write for probably an hour, hour and a half, and then I take a break and either do some research or do some reading, and then I'll write again for an hour and a half, and then I leave notes to myself of what I need to work on the next day. And I do this 5 days a week, and it's basically setting hours and then keeping them. Treating it like a job is what has helped me. When I didn't have the luxury of doing that every single day, I would pick one Saturday a week where I would go to my local library for a few hours in the morning and I would write then. So
yes, for the libraries.
Yes, I have written so many books at libraries because not only are the resources there, but it's quiet. There are corners you can sit in. It's free, which is nice when you aren't making any money on your writing, which is very common early on. But yeah, libraries are a great resource I think not enough people utilize. Or we think it's only where you go to check out a book, but there's so much more there that's available, whether it's presentations or writing groups or a quiet corner to sit in. Or, there's so many things there that I think we should take greater advantage of than we do.
Yeah.
Our participant shows the okay signs. She is approving, obviously, what you said.
Good.
There is a question from one of our participants here. What is the name of your very first book? And I think, even if it wasn't published, but
very first one, I'm trying to think if I even have a copy of it here. I probably do somewhere, but I'm not going to go search for it. Is called The Kiss of a Stranger, which is the most romance title you're ever going to hear. It was set in early 19th century London, and that was my very first one.
Was it your first published book after this, or?
No, which I think is really common, that the first book someone writes is not often the first book that he or she publishes. And that's, I think, helpful for aspiring writers to know, so they don't get discouraged if that first book isn't the thing that launches them forward, because it's really common for it not to be.
Yeah. We have 2 more questions from the participants. So, why historical romance?
Romance, because as we have established, I even expect the Terminator to be a romance. So everything I write.
Why is it historical? Why historical?
And historical because I love history. I began researching history for fun as a freshman in high school because I just found it really intriguing. I've tried writing contemporary romance, and my agent told me, this sounds like a historical novel set now. So I was like, yeah, I think that's a pretty good sign that history is where, that's just my wheelhouse. That's where I am the most excited to write, is in history.
The other question from the same participant was, how do you choose the titles for your books?
This is actually an interesting thing that I've learned as I have moved into being a published writer, is that writers don't choose the titles for their books.
Oh.
That's chosen by publishers. When I submit a manuscript, it has the title I have been giving it, and most publishers will also ask you for other suggestions, but in the end, the title is chosen by the publisher. I'm sure if an author absolutely hated the title, they could come up with something different, but titles and covers are chosen by publishers, not by authors.
But they ask you, do they ask you for approval after this?
They'll ask for my thoughts. And again, I'm sure if I was ever given a cover or a title that I absolutely hated, that it would be changed. I haven't ever had that happen. But yeah, we give input. And how much varies from publisher to publisher, but in the end, that final decision is the publisher's.
So does it bother you, the participant asks you? The title's taken.
Sometimes it's really hard to get my mind to shift to a new title when I've been calling it something else for however many months or years I've been working on it. That can be hard to get your brain to wrap around it. But once I do, I'm pretty okay with it. I haven't ever had a publisher choose a title that I really, really didn't like. Most of the time, the only difficulty is that it's different.
Was there a different title for The Gentleman and the Thief?
No, this one was the title I submitted it under, which is probably why I like it so much.
Yes. Okay, we have Olena.
Yeah, we have
Read the
another
next
question. Yes, again from the chat room. Besides books, have you authored for other publications such as journals, newspapers, magazines, and what are they?
I have written novellas and short stories that have been found in anthologies, but other than my junior high newspaper, I have not written for newspapers or magazines.
Where can we find it?
Hopefully nowhere. I can make no guarantees about the quality of my writing when I was 13.
So, as you mentioned that you are a fan of history, so like you personally, what is the most, like your favorite part of the history? What timeline is your favorite? Like,
Oh, I don't know. I honestly just love history. I think the thing that intrigues me the most is to see how even in different time periods and locations and eras and amongst varying cultures, so much is actually very much the same. You know, the things that people long for, the things that they dream about, the things that they need and want, the way that things disrupt their lives is so much the same. I think that's what I love most about history, is seeing that thread of humanity that weaves through everything. It has helped to broaden my perspective, to recognize what connects all of us as a human family now, but also what connects us to our own personal past, but also the past of all the people who live now and have lived. It helps to build a greater, I think, empathy for people and a greater understanding of the impact we can have, for good or ill, on the lives around us. Because as you look into the past, you see that with the perspective of hindsight. And I think that, to me, is the most intriguing part of history, is seeing that common thread that weaves through all of it.
thank you.
Thank you. The next question from participant is, does it bother you when a book is not historically accurate, even though it's fiction?
It's fiction. And that's usually the answer that I give, is to a degree, because it's fiction, there is some breathing room. There are amounts of inaccuracy that will bother me. I once read a book, and I'll give no details that will identify it, but in which toward the end, the hero, in this grand romantic gesture, gets on his horse to ride after the heroine to confess his love, and rode in a single day from London to Dublin on horseback. Which, again, you're laughing. It's not just a distance. There's the Irish Sea in the middle. So inaccuracies like that obviously are going to bother me. Or I read a book set in the Victorian era that talked about someone being on another person's radar, which isn't going to happen because radar wasn't invented. So things like that, things that actually pull you out of a story because they're so inaccurate or so unlikely, those can bother me. But I feel like in reading historical fiction, as long as I can feel like the author really tried to make things authentic and have that authentic feel, and do it in a way that I can lose myself in their story, for the most part, it doesn't really bother me. There are things that will when it's something glaring, but mostly I like to feel like the author tried, and if he or she did, that's good enough for me.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Like, when it comes to your writing, like, do you outline the plot, or just let the story just grow organically, like develop on its own?
I am a very, very deep outliner. I do a tremendous amount of outlining before I write, lots and lots of work before I even get started. And then before I write a scene, I outline that scene and then write it. So I do a lot of outlining. Not all authors do. I've just found that's what works for me. So yeah, I'm very much an outliner.
Very organized.
Yes, you are
And that
very
probably goes
organized.
back to being someone who would want to study physics and statistics and research. It's that logical brain side of me. Yeah.
So another question about aspiring authors. What was the road to getting published like? Do you have an advice for aspiring authors?
One thing I tell authors is that everyone's journey is going to look a little bit different. It's very easy for us to get discouraged if we look at someone who did manage to get their first book published on their first try with a great, huge deal with a big publisher, when that's not happening with us, or someone who is considering indie publishing or self-publishing, who looks at someone who is traditionally published and feels like their path is wrong, when in reality it's just different, because what we all need and what we all experience is different. So I think one of the things we need most as writers who are looking to be published writers is patience, because it all takes time. No matter what path you take, it takes time. A good support system, because discouragement and rejection are going to come no matter what path you take. I'm published now because I have over 60 published works, but I received over 100 rejections when I first started sending out queries to get published. And you'll talk to most successful authors and they will tell you, yeah, I've been rejected hundreds of times. It kind of goes with the territory. So patience and a good support system, and to write what you love. Because if you don't enjoy the writing on some level, then the discouragements that come with it will overshadow the joy that you can get out of it otherwise.
Okay, we have another question from participant. How did you end up writing the first book, if you even consider writing?
The way I first started writing was on a dare. So again, we all have very different journeys. I had been reading, I was on a historical romance kick, and had, again, all of my stories tie back to libraries, but I had gone through literally the entire romance section of my library over the course of, it's probably a couple of years, but had just gone through it, pulling things out, looking for books that I liked, and was telling my mother that I was frustrated that I wasn't finding more of the specific type of romance I liked best. And I fully expected her to be incredibly empathetic and tell me what a horrible, difficult life I was living. But instead she said, well, why don't you write one yourself? And I thought, why don't I? So I did, and I spent the next year and a half again, back at the library. I checked out every book they had on writing and read it and took notes. My local library at that time ended up holding a one-day writing symposium where they had brought in some writers to share aspects of writing, and I attended that. Wrote this book, did my best to edit it. Then I went to my local print shop and printed and bound it and gave it to my mom for Mother's Day about a year and a half after she gave me that challenge. And that was The Kiss of a Stranger. And that just started it all. I discovered I loved it. I enjoyed it. I got to research history, which I loved. I got to tell romantic stories, which helped me be less sad about the Terminator. And I've been writing ever since. So that's how I got started, was on a dare. Most authors do not begin things that way.
There's another question here. How do you react to the readers' comments?
In terms of like reviews and stuff, I don't respond to them. It's a good rule of thumb not to, because as a writer, you write the best story you can and you put it out there, and the experience readers have with it is independent of you, because they bring to it their own expectations, their own preferences, their own interpretation. And so it's best to leave that, because reviews aren't really for the author, they're for other readers. So I tend to leave those there. If people come to my social media and leave comments, I interact with them in the way that makes sense at the time. If it's a question about a book, I'll answer it if I'm able to. If it's when's the next one coming out, obviously. If it's I read this book and I didn't care for it, I usually don't respond to those just because I don't really know how. I don't want them to feel like their experience is invalid, but I'm not going to agree with them either. So for the most part, I interact in the ways that make sense in the situation. And a lot of times that means you don't respond to them at all.
Yeah. That makes sense.
So, like, yes.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Mary. No, Maggie, go ahead.
I was gonna ask, what do you do in your free time when you're not writing?
Free time?
Yeah,
No, I'm just kidding.
Free?
I think it is actually really important because it's easy for us to get consumed by our writing. I think it's actually really important to step away. I also play the piano, so I spend time doing that. I live in a really beautiful area of the country. We have some gorgeous mountains and canyons, and I'll go up there, spend some time in nature. I have a dog who demands to be walked a couple of times a day. And I have kids, so as a mom, there's always things that will fill your time there.
No free time.
Yeah.
So, who is your favorite composer?
Oh, there's so many. Of course, now you put me on the spot, right? It depends on what I'm in the mood for. I love Stanislavski, if you've heard of him. Mozart, obviously. I enjoy him because he's a very transitional composer. You hear the influence of the neoclassical being shifted into the romantic. Like, I love that. The first classical composer I really learned to play was Beethoven, so that is fun. Chopin is the one I go to when I want a challenge because his work is hard for me for some reason. So kind of depends on what I'm in the mood for.
Philip Glass, the contemporary one.
Pardon me?
Philip Glass.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Love it.
Did you try to play his?
I have not tried. I should. My collection, again, this is not a shock to anyone. My collection tends to be more historical, but I really love listening to newer composers. I should try to play them more. I think I would get a lot of enjoyment out of it, but I don't take the time. I should.
There was another question. A writing author that you like? Contemporary.
Do they mean someone who writes, an author who writes about writing?
A writing author.
Do you mean?
That's kind of my
guess. Let me ask you. Can you tell us your, other than yourself, your favorite historical romance author? In America. Currently.
Yeah.
That's too many questions.
There's one author who every time I read her work, I step back and think, man, I wish I could write like that. And that's Carla Kelly. She has been writing for probably 30 years now. So she has a huge backlog of books, but she's exceptionally good both at historical detail and characterization. There's some of her books I read 15 years ago that I still sometimes stop and think about her characters. And that to me is a sign of someone who's written a really incredible character. So she's one that I love and will read every time she publishes something.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
So, if anybody else wants to ask a question, please, you can write it in the chat now. We're almost at the end of our meeting.
I have a question. So, you obviously spend a lot of time writing, right? But do you find it stressful sometimes? You know, like you have like a writer's block. Does it bother you?
Yeah, and one thing I've learned over the years of doing this, that writer's block is usually a symptom of something else as opposed to a problem unto itself. And figuring out why I'm struggling helps more than anything. Sometimes it's I haven't taken time to do other things. You're talking about what do you do in your free time. It's easy for authors to not take time to do other things. Sometimes it's that I'm not feeling well and I need to give myself, time to feel better. Sometimes it's I'm writing a book, but the plot has gone astray and I need to figure out what I'm doing wrong. Sometimes I'm just burned out and I need to take time to work on something different or just read for a while. So I used to be really kind of terrified when I'd get writer's block, but as I've come to think of it less as a sign that I'm not good at what I do or that I should just stop trying, and instead look at it as what part of myself am I not taking care of right now? Or what part of my life needs attention? Or where have I gone wrong on this story? It helps me be less afraid of it because it becomes something I can address as opposed to something I can't push through.
So your life and your writing is completely intertwined, right? Like this.
It is. I have not learned the trick of not doing that. So I don't know if other authors have, but for me, they weave into each other.
I have a question. I remember we asked our other author 2 weeks ago. Have you ever based a character on somebody that you know?
Should I plead the fifth on that? I heard it said once that ordinary people make boring characters. And so I kind of ascribe to that idea. I will take aspects of people and build on them to create a character. So there are often bits and pieces of people I know woven into characters that I write. But no one who is just kind of picked up and dropped onto a page. One thing I've made sure to do is if I ever write a character who has really horrible parents, is to email my parents and say, this is not based on you. Just in case.
So you never had a friend being mad at you and say, why did you write about me? So horrible.
Not yet.
Good.
Right? Which is probably the safest thing an author can do.
Well, let me check the chat again. I don't think there's nothing. Olena, do you have anything?
I asked what I wanted to.
Well, thank you very much, Miss Eden.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
Thank you for
It was fun.
coming.
And I wanted to tell our participants, we partnered with our local Barnes & Noble in Manassas, so they might have some additional, they have Sarah's books, and also the library has a lot of the books. And you can visit them. They might have some additional perks there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thanks, you too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.